Hey, I'm Scott Hanselman, and by now you've probably heard about PowerApps, you've visited PowerApps.com, and you know what's going on, but you may have some questions. I'm a developer, you're a developer, and I've tried to put this into context. As a developer who primarily works in Azure, I think about PowerApps in the context of what I can do in the cloud and how I can make my business users happy. So I put together a slide deck here and some demos that I think explain it, or at least helped me understand what PowerApps and App Service mean to us. So when we hear about Azure, we have a tendency to see these big, scary diagrams, and they tend to build and build and build until it's a whole pile of icons that describe all of the different things that Azure has to offer. For some people, this is very exciting. For others, it's a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot of amazing stuff that you can do with Azure. But for me, I only focus on the pieces that make me happy and the pieces that make my business users happy. So I tend to simplify this kind of dramatic diagram with, I really oversimplify it. I take it down to its essence. This is my perspective. So you've got virtual machines, right? That's infrastructure as a service. We hear about this a lot when people lift and shift a virtual machine. You pick up a virtual machine that's been running under Anna's desk and you move it up into the cloud. That's step one. That's the step zero even. That's the first step to becoming a cloud computing organization, except it's a rather immature cloud. It's just the basics of picking up a machine and moving it. Starting to take advantage of the other things that Azure and Azure App Service have to offer can move you into a much more comfortable space. Virtual machines, when you make one, you manage them. Okay, you manage the operating system, you manage the apps. You are responsible for this virtual machine. But you have full power. You can do anything. You can run any language and any kind of application. So with power comes responsibility, and that can be overwhelming to some people. Jumping up to the top, you have a thing called web apps. This is part of App Service. Within App Service, you've got mobile apps and logic apps and API apps. Azure manages the operating system. So that's one less thing for you to have to think about. You have fewer languages that you can use, but they are the most popular languages like .NET, Node.js, PHP, Python, and Java. You can do rolling upgrades. You can do scale out. You have a lot of power with this platform as a service. And then in the middle is an interesting compromise where you have full power, the full control, and the full choice of languages, but still Azure manages the upgrades. You've got cloud apps that are a kind of stateless virtual machine, and then you've got Service Fabric, which do stateful microservices. So these are the elements of the Azure stack that I tend to use. One way to think about it is like this: infrastructure as a service. It's like owning your own car, right? You buy that car because you want to get from point A to point B, but you are responsible for that car. I know that when I was given a car, my mom said, you have to change the oil, right? That's just like running Windows Update and keeping it healthy. It has nothing to do with point A and point B, but it is part of the maintenance and the ownership of a car. With the center layer there, it's like a rental car where you have a car for hire, you use it, it's stateless, and then the car disappears. But then when you start thinking about platform as a service and software as a service, it's much more like a limousine. You have literally no worry at all. You don't have to drive. You don't have to maintain. You just simply think about the business problem. The business problem is moving from point A to point B. And it is that focus on the up-leveling, the thinking about the business problem and how we as software developers can solve the business person's problem and getting the right tools to solve those problems is what I think is exciting about the cloud. So taking this diagram back a little bit and focusing on App Service, Azure App Service, which is that platform we're going to build on that has web applications, mobile apps, API apps, logic apps, and more, all these different features that business users want, that developers need, abstracted away in such a way that we don't think about operating system updates. We use the language that make us happy, and it enables us to do all sorts of things. And it's not just these four kinds of applications, but it's also the capabilities that those applications bring to us, like federated sign-on, security, and isolation, and lots of different things. Now, when you're doing consumer-facing products, if you're a startup or you're doing an app or a game or you're putting an app in an application store, you'll use application service inside of Azure. And you'll be doing that with lots of other people who are also making great app services. And your consumer-facing application is going to use the public cloud, and you can scale as much as you want. But if you're an enterprise, if you're a business user who's working in a large enterprise, you might want a little bit more control about that. What's nice about App Service is that it's a metered style of billing. So, for example, I've got a little startup on the side. If that startup becomes super popular and famous, I'll probably quit and you'll never see me again. We got written up once in a magazine in Europe, so I scaled up my app service in Europe. And then when the traffic died down, I brought it down. So that metered billing made a lot of sense to me as a small developer doing something that was consumer facing. But an enterprise needs more than that. They want something that's more isolated. Maybe they'll want an app service environment, an environment of their own. They're going to want a cloud that is separated with a virtual network. And that virtual network is a natural extension, a part of their business, such that they can have features like site-to-site VPN and hybrid connections where on-site and on-premises and in the cloud communication can happen. I can have websites running in the cloud, authenticated against Azure Active Directory, talking to databases that live inside of my company. With application service environments, your own private area of the cloud, you have a lot more control of scale. You can have compute that is much larger. Still, the billing and the scaling of this is something you have to think about. Right? It's usage-based billing, and you have to scale it up and down. Azure App Service, to remind you, gives you all of these things, right? You get web applications you can scale. We know how to do those. You get Git deploy. You can publish from Visual Studio. You can use Node. You can do all sorts of great stuff. You can build mobile applications that talk to APIs and APIs that have managed APIs, and you can use technologies like Swagger. And then logic apps for workflows in the cloud. All of that is included when we go and build stuff in App Service. I can make a web app that has push notifications, or I can have a web app that has a background process that fires off a workflow. All of this is included. Now, let's put all of this information that we've just kind of absorbed into the context of what they announced with PowerApps. And you can, again, read about this at PowerApps.com. Something like PowerApps Enterprise is the combination of app service that you already know. You know how to do app service. You know how to use these technologies. But you're getting enhanced capabilities as a developer to create business apps. PowerApps also has a client-side and a front-end business user tool for creating a kind of application that business users want. And they also have a pricing model that's different from the usage model that I use for my small startup, my consumer-facing startup. Their pricing model is one that is done on a per-user basis. So you pay X dollars per user, and you have X number of users, and it's very predictable. Plus, you don't think about scale. The scale stuff is handled for us. So I can go and put out APIs that business users can consume using PowerApps and other technologies, and use all the stuff I already know how to do, plus I get all the other benefits. So it's a really nice thing for me as a developer because it makes me feel like my apps and my APIs can get out to a larger audience. Now here's the thing though, why are enterprise apps so hard to write? Why does the word enterprise seem scary? Well, it's because there's a bunch of stuff you have to do with an enterprise app that has nothing to do with the app itself. You write that expense app, remember that expense app that's sitting under Anna's desk, and then the boss says, with the kind of oversimplification that we hear bosses say, this is great, but make sure it federates with our Azure authentication. Suddenly, this is a business problem that's much bigger than my little expense reporting app, especially if it's a legacy application. So company-wide security and best practices around authentication are a problem. If they say something like, well, it's nice, but we're going to need single sign-on with some services that we have running, and then, oh, by the way, we've just introduced OneDrive for Business, so we're going to need you to do authentication to that as well. So your legacy app now has to put expense reporting receipts in OneDrive for Business. Suddenly, these simple business requirements become huge weights on my shoulders as a developer. There may be other places to pull data in, other disparate systems written in different languages, and I want to pull all that into my app service within my enterprise. Even more, We've got more and more mobile people out with mobile devices and tablets out in the world. They don't want to necessarily have to VPN in to get access to data. We've got a mobile business user who wants an internal app available outside the enterprise. How do you deal with that? PowerApps plus App Service is going to make that happen. And it's PowerApps Enterprise that allows you to get access to all this stuff. So here's the first-party apps. Here's the common sources of business data. This is the kind of stuff that we see all the time, right? There's SAP and there's Oracle and there's all the different places where data lives in our lives. And then more and more we're seeing consumer software as a service like the Twitters and the Dropboxes and things like that. That can be absolutely overwhelming. So what I like about what's going on with PowerApps Enterprise plus App Service is that we can potentially make this information available everywhere. So here's some small examples, like all the APIs from Office 365 to something as low level as FTP and everything in between can be made available as registered APIs within App Service. I can use them in my web apps, my mobile apps, whether they be pro dev apps that I wrote with Xamarin and Visual Studio, or whether they be business user apps that I created with the PowerApps. I can manage and monitor the API access at a very granular layer with the API hubs. And then all these different apps have permissions that can be controlled with Active Directory that you're already using to secure permissions throughout your enterprise. So for me as a pro developer, I'm going to go and build these mobile apps, these web apps, the way I know how with Azure App Service. But for an enterprise, I can do this in an app service environment where I don't have to think about scale the way that I used to. Use any language that makes me happy, .NET and Node, Python, PHP, or Java. Do it in Visual Studio. Do it in Visual Studio Code. But I can get access to these APIs, both first-party and third-party, data inside and out, in a way that is reliable and that is secure and that is managed entirely by that PowerApps Enterprise and App Service experience. So I've talked a lot, but I think this kind of sets the context about how I, as a developer, think about it. So let's stop talking and let's start coding. I'm going to jump into Visual Studio and spend some time in detail showing you how I can take an older legacy application, give it new functionality that wasn't even invented when this application was written. I'm going to have that running in App Service, and then we're going to pull that into a Power App and then maybe an application that we'll create in something like Xamarin. So let's do that right now. All right, so here's the scenario. Many, many years ago, probably 2001, 2002, I did some work for a place here in Portland called Pioneer Courthouse Square. And Pioneer Courthouse Square has this brick finder. All these bricks were purchased by different people, and they had a database of these bricks, and it was in Access 1995. And I upgraded it to SQL Server, and it was a horrible database, and I'll show it to you, but it's a legacy application from a reasonably sized enterprise. That's our scenario. You could go up and you could search. You can do this actually right now. You can go up to Pioneer Courthouse Square, click on the brick finder, and this is the app that I wrote many, many, many years ago, and I'll search for example, my grandmother, and there she is. And what we'll do is we'll search the database, and there we find in 1991, she bought a brick, and it is located right here, and then I can go find it. If you have trouble finding your brick, you can send them a note. You can send them a brick request, and they'll go and try to find that. But this is pretty manual. This is an email at this point. So I thought it would be an interesting scenario to basically take this legacy application and update it. This was written again in 1995 and then upgraded in 2001. This is before tablets and ubiquitous Wi-Fi, ubiquitous cell phones. What if we could build an API on top of this, build a Power App on top of this, and then as pro developers, open up Visual Studio and use that RESTful API and create maybe an Android app using native code? Then the volunteers could go out and take a photograph of grandma's brick and then send it to me. Or they could put it in Dropbox or OneDrive for Business or something like that. So let's see what that would look like. Now I want to point out again that the database is just a nightmare. So forgive me ahead of time. But this is what's great about legacy applications, right? Here's one table per year. Not exactly ideal, but a great way to take a legacy application without necessarily changing its schema is to create views. So we've got a bricks view, which rolls all those up by year, and then we've got brick requests. So here are the requests, and then the resulting URL and image date and latitude and longitude that I'll take from the native application, and we'll go and we'll be able to take a picture of a brick and then send it off to people who are interested. So it's a great example of how to take an older application but bring it into the modern world. Certainly, of course, I could write something from scratch. But what we'll do is we'll head over into Visual Studio, and I'm going to say New Project. And I'll make an ASP.NET Web application, and I'm going to call it BrickWeb. We'll hit OK. And this is going to pop up a dialog with the different projects I could pick. Specifically, I'm going to make an Azure API app. So this is going to make a REST API, right? A REST API is going to have a nice friendly URL. It's going to allow paging, get, post, put, delete, things like that. I could say a web API, but I know this one's going to be in Azure, and we're going to end up putting this into Azure App Service and consume it from PowerApps. So it's going to be in our Azure App Service environment. So we're going to say New Project, and it's going to bring in the things that we need. Here's our Azure API app. And that model already exists, right? It already exists in the database. So I'm going to right-click and say Add New Item. I'm going to pick Data. I'm going to make an entity data model. We'll call it BricksDB. Hit Add. Now I can do it from the database. I can make a code first. I'm going to say code first from database. So we're going to generate C# code by looking at the database. So I'm going to make a new connection here to the database. All right, so I've pasted in my server name and my SQL Server authentication. We'll hit OK. We're going to connect to that database, and we're going to save that in our web config. Now I've got lots of different tables. Remember, I've got one per year. I don't want to use that, though. We'll build our application on top of a view. In this case, I'll pick the Brick Requests one, and we'll make a little sample application that people can use to manage requests for bricks. So we'll hit Finish, and then you'll notice that we're going to go and generate this data model. This is a C# data model. All right, so our application got created here, and you see we've got a Brick Request class that looks exactly like our view, right? It was generated from that view, and we've got our BricksDB. We have enough information here to go and create a web API. So I'm going to say new, not new controller, but new scaffolded item. I'm going to make a web API controller using the entity framework. So we know enough about our system here. And actually, I'm just going to do a build first to make sure we've got the right updated metadata. Add new scaffolded item, web API controller, Brick Request. There's our data context. We'll say use async, and I'm just going to make this a little simpler and call it Bricks controller and hit Add. So this is going to go and scaffold out, generate out a web API with get, put, delete, post, and all those things. So this lets me get a Brick request. Now this is a RESTful API using JSON, and as such, these usually have a thing called Swagger. Swagger is a kind of a description language for RESTful APIs. And there's a UI that's created by an open source project called Swashbuckle. I'm going to search for Swagger, and specifically I want not this line in Swagger config called Enable Swagger. This is actually a great, well-documented little application here. I want this, Enable Swagger UI. So I'm going to uncomment that bit. I'm going to hit Build, and we will run this application locally. When I run this locally, you see right off the bat it says forbidden. That's because I didn't have a default page. I'm going to type in Swagger, and that brings me to this nice UI that is created for. This is basically the API. That's the web API that we're going to publish to Azure. Here's a test page for each of those. So this is the shape of the data, and I'm going to actually hit try it out. You can actually click try it out, call right into the system, and you see the different requests. And here's a request for Grandma's brick right there. So I can go and manage these here. This is real live data coming back from Azure. It just happens to be coming from localhost. The database is up in Azure. So let's publish that. We'll publish that here into Azure, into our application service environment. Let's go back to our Brick Finder, and we're going to hit right click and publish. I can pick Azure App Service. I'm going to pull out my demo subscription here, and we're going to publish this to Bricks1. All right, so I hit OK. That fills out everything that I need. and I'll remove any additional files, and I'll make it debug in case we have any issues. And then I'm going to hit publish. So this is going to start publishing out to here. So here's Azure Websites, Bricks 1. It's going to show up in our Azure Application Service. It just got deployed, being sent up again. Here it says, can't get to this page. Remember, I didn't make a home page. I can say Swagger. I can see now it's running up there. Now this is a web API that is up in Azure that I can start talking to right now, but I want a managed API. Okay, the volunteers need to be a member of my Active Directory, they're a member of my organization, they're treated like employees, so I need authorization and I need security and authentication. I might have some people be allowed to do one operation and some be able to do other operations, but I don't want to write all that code. So that's the magic, right? Let's go into our PowerApps section of the portal. And we're going to take that API that we just made and we're going to make it an IT managed API. We're going to tell the system about that API and make sure that it's managed by our organization. So here's a list of all the different APIs that you could pick from in OneDrive and Dropbox. In our application service environment, we've got a number of different APIs, some managed by Microsoft, some managed by IT. We've got apps. I am going to add a new API, the one that we just published. So I'm going to say add. I'll call it Hansel Bricks. And we're going to say APIs hosted within the app service environment. All right? So it's listed out the ones in our environment. There's Bricks 1 that we just published. We'll hit OK, and it's going to go and create that API. There it is. There's Hansel Bricks, right? That's an IT managed API running within our app service environment. Now, different projects, different applications, different kinds of roles are going to want to access this. So you call those connections. We might have volunteers, we might have administrators, we might have iPhone apps, we might have Windows tablets. I'm going to add a new connection. So we're going to just name this. This is just a display name. So we'll say the volunteers will be 1. Okay. We'll hit O right. Here's the connection for volunteers. And volunteers can be a one user or a group of users, a list of users. I'm going to go and add some user access because I need access to this, and I might add other volunteers or the entire volunteers group. So here, we're going to say add, and we'll say that these people can edit. We want volunteers to be able to edit. So I'm going to go and search for my address. So there's me. So we'll add me to the system, and I am now a volunteer. So there's that user added to the connection. I'm just going to back out. Okay, so now the volunteers connection exists, and it has users in it. So now the runtime URL for that is different. See this here? That is the managed URL. So I'm going to go and add a new tab and just show you what that looks like. See? This is this Azure API managed URL. If I hit that, again, remember, no home page. I could say API/bricks. I could hit Swagger. When I hit API/bricks, it says unauthorized, right? Because you need to authorize that connection. I need to be Scott H.A. or I need to be a volunteer to call that. So what I've got there is instantly I have taken a legacy application. I've made it available via a nice clean RESTful API, and then without having to write any code, it's already involved in my Active Directory. And I can give people access to it. All right? So let's do something with that. Let's start with a business application, a Power App, and then we'll move our way up to a more complicated application. I'm going to click Start from Your Data. You'll notice that I already have a connection, right? It's that Bricks API from before. When I click on that connection, and again, I could pick lots of different connections, SQL Server and Dynamics. But I'm going to click on my data set here. I'm going to pick specifically the Bricks. We'll hit Connect.
Now, because I'm logged in as Scott HA, it goes and configures that connection, the one that we set up. It's been authorized against me and my user. It's going to go and build an app because it knows about the shape of that application. It knows about the schema. So it's going to build a nice little simple CRUD application from the template. This is real data. There's Grandma again. And I could go and pick different layouts. Maybe I could pick one with pictures, and I could add the pictures of the bricks here a little bit later. And then each one of these little pieces of information is data bound. See, there's the shape of that brick request object. And then from here, I could go and run this app, and I've got a mobile app now, all right? So this is what the business user will do with the PowerApps application. But we are pro developers, so we're going to take it a little bit to the next level. But it's nice to know how easy it is to go and make an application for a business user using an authenticated API that's running within our Azure service environment. Let's switch over to Visual Studio. Okay, and instead I'm going to call that same API, but I'm going to call it from some C#. I'm inside of Visual Studio, and we're going to use Xamarin 4.0, along with the Microsoft Android emulator. So we've got the Android emulator running here in Hyper-V. And this application is the one that the volunteers will go out into the square looking for bricks, take a picture of them, and then send that information back. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that scenario is that you might have an occasionally connected situation. You might not have internet, you might not have Wi-Fi, maybe they're out on iPod touches, or maybe they're on small Android devices. So you're going to want offline as well. So we've made our call to we got our set up for our API, but we have our local SQLite store, and we've put in some local file sync. So check this out. Let's go ahead and run this application, and this is going to fire up a 5-inch emulator of a KitKat phone. So here, starting up, is our Android application. Again, this is running on the Microsoft Visual Studio Android emulator. Runs on Hyper-V. This application was created with the mobile SDK for Azure. And in this case, because it's an emulator, I don't have a camera. So I'm going to use a picture of of Grandma's brick that I took earlier. So when we click on camera, it will use that picture. All right. So here are the requests. It pulled those requests from that mobile service. And we have added a little bit of information around the idea that you could save an image. Okay, you can save an image locally. So we'll click on Grandma. Here's the location of Grandma's brick. Hit Add Image. Take a photograph of the brick. There's the real actual brick in the square there in Portland. Take the picture. Hit OK. Now we're going to attach this. We're going to back up. But in this case, we are not connected, so we haven't synchronized that. That's waiting to sync. That synchronization is built in. We've added a file sync handler, which is nice, okay, for deleting local files, updating files, and making sure that what's going on locally is in sync with what's going on remotely. I'll just do a little pull to refresh. And now that image has been sent up into Azure. So where did that image go? Again, it could go to any number of connections that are held within our application, but in this case, we put it into Azure Storage. I'm going to fire up the Azure Storage Explorer. This is a really great cross-platform app. You can get it at storageexplorer.com. And I'm going to take a look at, there it is. See, here is the blob container and then the image that was uploaded. So we took that photograph and we uploaded it here. And again, it could go anywhere. It could be in the database. It could be in Google Drive. It could be whatever. That's the flexibility that we've got. And what's nice here is that we're calling the same API, the same managed API, the same authenticated API. We're getting involved in creating a Power App. We're doing things as a pro developer. All of these new scenarios are being turned on just by virtue of the fact that we moved our legacy application into the cloud, made it a managed API, and now suddenly we can do all this great stuff. Now it's worth pointing out when you register that API, when you go and tell Azure about an API, like I did back here under Manage APIs, they don't all have to be inside of Azure. They could be hosted anywhere. They can be written in anything. I wrote my API in ASP.NET and C#. You could write yours in Python, or you could write it in Node.js. Those can be managed APIs as well. But it's better if it's hosted within the Azure service environment, because then you get that network level security, you get that Swagger discovery, you get the understanding that there is an API definition and that we know about that within the system. So we've taken this old database from Access many, many years ago, 20-year-old database, but a great legacy application that has worked and has served literally thousands of people. We've wrapped it as a view, put a nice clean web API around the top of it, made that web API available descriptively as Swagger. Again, at every step of the way, I could have been more descriptive. I could have changed column names. I could have changed data types. We could have done transformations. Then we brought that into our Azure service environment, and it became a managed API, one of the many managed APIs running in here. I can then consume that via PowerApp, right? Distribute that PowerApp to other people within my enterprise. Or as a pro developer, I can go and create an application using C# or whatever language makes me happy. In this case, we're using Xamarin and talking to Android, and then write a nice pro application that talks to that backend database, gets real data, and then adds a new scenario, the ability to take a photograph, send it into the cloud, and now send that along to someone who requested that image with the Brick Finder. Even better, I could add additional scenarios here where I could send it in an email, do other kinds of software as a service integrations. After I save the brick, maybe we kick off a Logic app, send an email, let them know that it happened, whatever I want to do. Now that I've got these pieces that I can plug together, really the world is my oyster. I can do whatever makes me happy.
So right there, you saw how easy it is for me to take a legacy application and light it up with Azure App Service and then plug it into PowerApps. PowerApps is going to enable pro developers to do a lot more with the things that they already know how to use. I'm using the languages that make me happy, I'm using the IDE that makes me happy, and I'm putting it up in a cloud that's enabling me to scale in the way that I need to, but also it's giving me new functionality and new capabilities, easier authentication, simpler pricing model, and it's making the apps and the data that I'm creating available to a whole new audience of business users and information workers, which I think is pretty cool. So I encourage you to check it out at PowerApps.com. Thanks a lot.